There's a Wednesday deadline that's looming in the Sunshine State, the state of Florida. That's the date by which Florida officials need to respond to a Justice Department letter about the state's controversial voter purge. Federal officials wrote that it appears that the state might be in violation of federal voter protection laws. The purge was put in place after Florida's Republican governor, Rick Scott, asked the state to identify non-U.S. citizens who had registered to vote illegally. Now, officials so far have identified about 2,600 voters as suspicious using information from the Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles. Still unclear, though, how many of those identified are, in fact, unable to vote, are not allowed to vote. Joining me now, one of the key opponents of the purge is Democratic Congressman Ted Deutch of the state of Florida. Nice to see you, sir. Thanks for talking with us. Certainly appreciate it. So let's go back to the very beginning. Right, I appreciate that. The DOJ and the Homeland Security back in October of 2011, forgive me, could have answered the question and actually given forth information to the state of Florida in their request to figure out who is on the rolls that's not eligible to be on the rolls. Ultimately, that is a perfectly valid question. Who's on the rolls that should not be on the rolls to vote, correct?
Sure, absolutely. It's a valid question, and it's an issue that supervisors of elections throughout Florida take very seriously, and they take it seriously all year long. The question, Soledad, is why did Governor Scott come up with a list of 180,000 names that tend to skew more Hispanic, more Democratic, and put that list out less than 3 months before a primary election, less than 6 months before a general election, when we've seen already that there's an enormous number of eligible voters who will be kicked off the rolls as a result. That's the problem. That's why the Justice Department stepped in. That's why we've been pushing.
But he made that request originally to try to figure out that 180,000, how many of them actually were correlated to people who should not be on the rolls back in October of 2011, so well in advance of the 3 months. It looks like the Homeland Security just did not answer his request. Isn't that what happened?
I think that it's important for the governor to sit down with the supervisors of elections, have his administration do so, and figure out the best way to go through a list to make sure that there's not voter fraud. What we're at risk of doing here, what we're at risk of seeing, Soledad, is election fraud. You have to take a step back for a minute and look at the fact that in the 2008 election, there were 16 cases of voter fraud out of 8 million votes cast. We now have a list of 180,000 names.
Well, it's been whittled down to 2,600, but I agree with you. That's still a ton. That 180,000 is now looks like it's 2,600 people who they've identified as suspicious. So, which is still a huge number of people who might be having their voting rights impinged upon. If you look at what they're doing in Miami-Dade. When they went through and looked at 505 people who were contacted, it turned out that 492 of them, who they were able to reach, were citizens. 13 were not citizens, and they were purged, which gives you something like 98% were wrongly on that list. Is that what your big concern is?
My concern, first of all, Soledad, just to correct you, the 2,600 names that everyone's talking about is really just the first step. The governor hasn't retreated from his list of 180,000 names. And when you look at the results thus far in the first 2,600, we're at risk, because of this brazen political ploy, we're at risk of disenfranchising tens of thousands of Florida voters. And in a state which has a history, not of voter fraud, but of not making votes count, with very close elections, that's a horrible decision, which really was meant to suppress voter turnout and to suppress the vote. That's why we have to be so vigilant, making sure it doesn't go forward.
And I think what was also interesting here, the governor was warned before this took place that, look, take the precautions before you go down this route. Also remember, in 2000, Governor Jeb Bush, they also purged the voting rolls then. A number of people who were eligible voters were caught up in that.
Wrongfully purged.
Well, and how many votes the state was decided by?
537. But here's the issue. I mean, this is an issue that's been going a long time. A writer for the Miami Herald, Carl Heisen's been writing about dead people on voter rolls for over a decade. I mean, this is something clearly, the rest of Americans look back and say, what is wrong with Florida? Can they get their voter rolls together? Because it just seems like they're unable to.
Well, let's put that question to the Congressman. What's wrong with the state of Florida? Or do you think that the state of Florida is not an aberration?
Yeah, no. I think it's a good question. The question is, what's wrong with the Scott administration? Why is it that they're creating this image of voter fraud run wild when in fact it's the Scott administration's position that will disenfranchise tens of thousands of legitimate voters. You know, there's a World War II vet that I met with last week who received a letter from the state of Florida saying, we have evidence to believe that you are not a United States citizen, a Bronze Star Battle of the Bulge veteran. That's what's wrong with this purge. The issue of voter fraud is one that we have to take seriously. But what Governor Scott is engaged in, and what's happening around the country, frankly, is election fraud meant to suppress the vote. That's why we have to be vigilant, and that's why we can't let this go forward and why I'm battling it.
Congressman Ted Deutch joining us this morning, a Democrat out of the state of Florida. Thanks for being with us. Appreciate that.